Hello, and welcome to the second half of the International Association for Impact Assessment's virtual forum series, Think Big, 2050 City Megagrowth, Assessing and Addressing the Impacts. I'm Heather Goldstone, Chief Communications Officer at Woodwell Climate Research Center. We are an independent nonprofit conducting science for solutions at the nexus of climate, people, and nature. We partner with communities and leaders around the globe for just meaningful impact to address the climate crisis. Increasingly, that means making actionable climate risk information accessible to communities, to business leaders, and to national level policymakers. But we know that it's not enough to simply share the risks. The challenge we face now is to address multiple social and ecological crises at, to quote John Durr, speed and scale. And given the current state and trajectory of our climate and ecological systems, as well as many of our social systems, it is no longer enough to simply mitigate or avoid further harm. What is needed is deeply restorative action on multiple overlapping fronts: climatological, ecological, economic, and social. We know that impact assessment has an important role to play, but the technical expertise and analytical insights of impact assessors need to reach decision makers and the public and be integrated with the insights and expertise of many others. IAIA's strategy for accomplishing this emphasizes the importance of building alliances and communicating with other public and private audiences. Today's speakers will provide examples of this in action and open the door to reimagining impact assessment within the context of efforts to maintain and improve the health of environmental and social systems at all scales across the globe. Our first speaker is Peter Croal. Peter is a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society and holds a Bachelor of Science Geology degree from Carleton University. He's been working in the field of environmental assessment and international development for over 40 years, focusing on the relationship between environmental management, climate change, resource extraction, and poverty reduction in developing countries and the Arctic. Peter has been a member of IAIA since 1994, and his talk today will explore how community groups are interacting with the traditional planning system in the city of Ottawa to address a range of issues related to housing, poverty, infrastructure, equity, and transportation, and helping to make Ottawa more resilient in the face of increasingly frequent and severe extreme weather events.
Hello, everybody. My name is Peter Croal, and I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, Canada. And this is on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe First Nations. Grateful to be in their territory. And I am very pleased to be with you today to talk about cities and all the issues that are happening with them. And in particular, I want to bring to you kind of like a case history of what's been happening in Ottawa, the capital of Canada, but it's got some real serious issues. And I have been working in the field of impact assessment for 35 years, and I'm a geologist, but now retired and working at the local level on climate change. And I hope what I'm going to say to you today resonates with some of the cities that you live in as climate change starts to take its toll around the world. A lot of my issues are going to look at governance and how we address governance at a local level. And I hope to provide you with some solutions as well. So really, to kick things off, what is the state of play in Ottawa? A very beautiful city, capital of Canada, G7 capital. And I have one word to describe the city of Ottawa and its actions towards climate change and some of the environmental issues that we're facing, and it's troubling. I love my city very much. It's very beautiful, and I hope to see you in my city someday and enjoy what it has to offer. But it's got some very serious limitations with respect to climate change management. And here's possibly the core issue that I want to bring to your attention, is that the Ottawa Council the mayor and council for the last 30 or 40 years has probably ridden on the coattails of the federal government. The federal government has its seat of power in Ottawa, and it spends a lot of money on federal assets. So if you were to come to Ottawa and say, and if I were to ask you, what do you find beautiful about the city of Ottawa? You would say, well, the museums are gorgeous. There's a beautiful canal. There's this lovely park called Gatineau Park, north of Ottawa. There's all sorts of galleries, the National Arts Centre, all of these sorts of things, a lot of green space and green belt, that kind of thing. But the thing is, all those assets are federal. They haven't been designed or implemented at the municipal level. So if you were to strip away all those assets in the city of Ottawa that are federal, I think you'd be left with a fairly bland, uninspiring municipal landscape. Our council, I don't think, has learned how to think big or to think like a capital or to think like a G7 country. And I'll give you some more examples at the municipal level. We have in Ottawa a beautiful place called Lansdowne Park, where exhibitions were held and sort of agricultural fairs and things like that. It's a city-owned asset, and it's right next to a UNESCO asset. It's right next to the Rideau Canal, which was built for the War of 1812, and it's a gorgeous canal that winds its way through the city of Ottawa. And about 22 acres of land became available within Lansdowne Park for redevelopment, right next to the UNESCO site. And when it was all said and done, what we got were box stores, bars, and shiny, bright places to have a drink and eat. It was not very inspiring at all. In fact, I don't think anybody could walk through this new redevelopment landscape and say, I would like to invite friends from around the world to come and see this. It's nothing but box stores. There's one example. Another example is most modern cities have light rail transit. They've had them for 20, 30, 40 years. The city of Ottawa has just about completed first phase of its light rail transit, and it's been a disaster. It really has. There's been failure after failure after failure. Brakes don't work, the doors don't work, the tunnels leak, there's been sewage issues, the floors are too slippery when it's wet, the axles are too weak and they break on corners. If it's too cold, the train stops. If it's too hot, the train stops. Anyway, all of this is trying to be dealt with in kind of a jury-rig situation. A commission was held to see what the problem was with the light rail transit in Ottawa, and the judge that reviewed this this billion-dollar project said there was gross malfeasance at all levels. So there you go. There's another example. We have an NHL stadium, the Ottawa Senators, good hockey team, but the stadium is 25 kilometers away from the downtown core. And I think we're the only franchise in the NHL that has its stadium 25 kilometers from the downtown core. We have a pedestrian bridge that had to be destroyed and rebuilt again over a freeway. We have potholes in the wintertime that actually get national coverage and get named. And so these problems are kind of a lead to governance issues and the failure to sort of think big and know how to manage large-scale projects. And why is this? Ottawa is a city of 1 million people. It was amalgamated in 2001, and we have this rural and urban divide now. A lot of agricultural land around the city of Ottawa, where more conservative people vote, and in the urban core, you get more left-leaning people. So this has caused some tension on council over the last 20 years and continues to this day. The council has also been criticized for being too close to the developers. And there's always a lot of money to be made, a lot of taxes to be had because of development, but at the expense of green space and the expense of sound, sustainable planning. The crowning blow to the governance issues in Ottawa was in February of 2022. Perhaps you heard this, but during the vaccine mandate time in Canada, there were a lot of various types of mandates permitted you to travel or not travel, or work or not work, depending on whether you had the vaccines. And it resulted in a convoy of trucks coming to the city of Ottawa. And this convoy of trucks actually occupied the downtown core of Ottawa for 3 weeks. And during those 3 weeks, the trucks and the people that sort of joined that parade voiced their concerns by blowing the horns on the trucks constantly, 24 hours a day. It was an unbelievable situation in Ottawa. We couldn't move downtown. People were being harassed by the people that are occupying the downtown core. There was racist issues, misogynist issues, harassment at all levels. And these trucks were parked 10 meters from the Prime Minister's office. These trucks rolled into Ottawa, parked, set their air brakes, and started blowing their horns. And they were never inspected to see if there's any kind of explosives inside. And this would not happen in any other place around the world. Just trying to imagine if there was a convoy like that pulling into downtown core of Kabul, the downtown core of Kabul probably wouldn't exist. So that's kind of an example of problems that we've got in Ottawa. And it took actually, at that convoy, it took a 21-year-old federal civil servant, a woman, to file a class action lawsuit to get the trucks to stop blowing their horns. And there was another commission done to discover what the issues were around that convoy. And again, there was failure of governance at all levels to sort this out. So these kind of issues perplex me. We are capital of the country, and what we have now is a population of people who have lost faith in the governance capacity of the city of Ottawa. Add to this, in the last 5-10 years, and more recently, we've had many floods. We've had major ice storms, tornadoes. We had our first derecho. A derecho is a Spanish word for very violent, fast-moving storm, which destroyed much land and trees in Ottawa and houses. We have the emerald ash borer, which is an invasive species of beetle, which has destroyed many of our forests. We have poor house designs, and our bylaws are somewhat outdated. A climate emergency was declared in 2019, but you really wouldn't know it the way the city is responding. It's trying. We have a new council and a new budget, and things are starting to turn around. But for the last 15 years, it's been a very, very tough slog to get climate change on the agenda. We have hope that this new council and this new mayor will start turning things around. The budget this year has $5 million devoted to climate change, which I think if you looked at your own cities, you would see that the budgets were a lot higher in your own cities for climate change. But it is a sign that there is a progressive responsibility characteristic happening in council for responding to climate change. And lastly, the last example is we have this developer-influenced project southeast of Ottawa called Tewin. That's spelled T-E-W-I-N. And 25,000 trees were cut for this development. These trees were cut at night under cover of darkness. And it was actually the citizens of Ottawa who had to fly their own drones to see what was happening behind the perimeter of that operation. We have a bylaw in place that's supposed to prevent tree cutting like that, but it wasn't really respected. So we have reached a lot of people in Ottawa the tipping point of frustration with council and frustration with the speed at which climate change is moving through the city of Ottawa. And to respond to that in a more positive way, what we have formed in our small group, as I said, I'm retired now, and myself and 7 other retired consultants, specialists who have had long careers, have formed a group called Citizen Climate Council. And we spend our days trying to show the city of Ottawa how to improve governance at the local level. And one of our major projects this year was the release of a climate change accountability report, which showed the city of Ottawa, its status of how it was responding to 159 planned actions to address climate change, and most of those actions got a pretty poor grade. However, as I said, we do have a budget and a council that seems to be following some more sustainable paths, and we look to the future with them to try to see if we can actually get more of those 159 commitments actually initiated. There's other similar groups in Ottawa that are mobilizing and becoming more active in a very partnership-oriented way, not in the sense of Extinction Rebellion demonstrations, but in more policy advocacy and trying to show the city of Ottawa how to create policy and create guidelines that are more sustainable for the city of Ottawa. The Montreal Pledge on Biodiversity was just recently signed by the city of Ottawa. We didn't sign it in Montreal in December of 2022 when 47 other cities were signing on, but we were late to the game. However, we have signed on, and nature-based solutions is going to be a focus of our work going forward with the Citizen Climate Council. The solution to what I think is a crisis on climate change is acting locally. And that's the main message that I want to bring to you that are watching this video and tuning into this mega city growth video conference that we're having, is that all environmental issues occur at the local level. And we really have to kind of think more closely about that to see what does that really mean at the street level, at the neighborhood level, community level, and regional level. And to give you an example of that, the world is trying to maintain a average temperature increase of 1.5 degrees. And recent reports have shown that we're going to bust through that plateau very quickly, and we're going to go over 1.5. On average, Canada is at 1.9, and in the Arctic is over 2.4. So really 1.5 is kind of an arbitrary statistic when you look at local levels. So my message to you all today is that even though we're struggling to try to maintain 1.5 degrees, we can modify the heat island effect and climate change effects at the local level. And together, if we're working together, then maybe we can bring down the global average. My 4 takeaway messages for you for this video series is this. And this is what C3, the Citizen Climate Council, is trying to do. We're trying to challenge the status quo. We're trying to show council different ways of creating policy and different ways of implementing them to respect climate change and the emergency that has been declared in 2019. We're trying to learn new ways of doing municipal governance. So our group does research, and we send the good things that we find to council and to staff to show them better ways of doing that. And that's also part of the third point, which is educating council, educating the public and staff on better ways of addressing climate change at the local level. And the fourth point is nudging. You've probably heard of behavioral economics, this nudge theory, where instead of trying to do everything all at once, do small things which lead to bigger things. So that is what we're doing with local tree planting, water gardens, rain gardens, this kind of thing, just to get the politicians to see that actually citizens are engaged and they want to help. I want to conclude by thanking you for listening, and I hope this has been of some value to you. As I said, my closing statement really is about looking at the local level. And I worked in international development for 20 years, and it was a wonderful career. And actually, I think that the work I'm doing now in retirement probably has more traction because I'm dealing with friends and neighbors and local people that affects my daily life and the daily lives of the people that I engage with socially and on a professional level. It's kind of nice to see change happening in your own city because of your own actions that you're trying to put forward. And that one report I mentioned, the accountability report that we did for the city, is available to you if you want to see how we structured that report and show the city how it could respect the climate change emergency in a better and more sustainable way. And if you wish, here's my email. Please reach out to me, and I'll give you the link to so you can read that report and perhaps maybe use it as a model for your own cities. So I wish you a lot of good luck with the work you're doing on making your cities more livable. Oh yeah, there's one last thing to say about livable cities. You've heard of the 15-minute neighborhoods. Maybe you haven't, but in Canada, the term 15-minute neighborhood means we must plan our cities so that within a 15-minute walk or bicycle ride, you can find most of the amenities you need to live a happy life. Food stores, drug stores, clothing stores, this kind of thing. All the services you need are within a 15-minute bike ride or walk. And we run into people who think that the 15-minute city means that it's a conspiracy by the government to put a border around your community so that you can't leave. And I don't know where people are getting this information, but if you were to Google conspiracy theory 15-minute cities, you would see all kinds of fake news, false news, all sorts of conspiracy people talking about that this is just another government plot to control people, when actually it's the opposite. However, that is the world we live in. Artificial intelligence is part of that now too, and we have to address that. So with that, I wish you good conference. I hope you reach out to me to comment on what I've been saying. And if you want to get that accountability report, I'd be happy to send it to you. And I hope to see you someday in Ottawa or perhaps at a conference coming up soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. Our next speaker is Karen Shippey. Karen has a master's from the University of Cape Town and over 25 years of experience. As an EIA practitioner for 15 years, she focused on infrastructure projects. Moving into regional government in 2011, she became a senior manager in the Western Cape province of South Africa. She's responsible for leadership across the provincial climate change, green economy, sustainability, biodiversity, and coastal management portfolios. And since 2017, she has also become the gender focal point for the department and developed a passion for gender mainstreaming. In this presentation, she considers the issue of growing informality in the urban fabric, exploring the role of planning and of impact assessment in building towards improved practice and the needed shift to restorative development that leaves no one behind.
Hello, everybody. My name is Karen Shippey, and I'm going to be talking about the reality of urban informality and impact assessment. So I work for the Department of Environmental Affairs and Development Planning within South Africa in the Western Cape region. In South Africa, poverty and inequality are explicitly linked to our history and the apartheid planning regime. Our towns did not grow organically. They were actively segregated by the Group Areas Act, which was violently enforced. Areas were designated for particular racial groups, and the best areas and opportunities were given to white citizens. Migrant labor policies allowed only men to work in our mines, and this split families across the country. Homelands were developed in rural areas in order to contain those families whose husbands, brothers, and fathers had migrated to the city to find work. And insufficient resources were provided for infrastructure in those areas. In South Africa, our spatial planning was explicit and brutal in its extent. But we are not the only ones. Perhaps it was more explicit in our country, but colonialism, neighborhood segregation, First Nation reserves, there is a lot that is actively and systemically built into the towns that we have and the planning that we have. That segregation which causes many people of color to be in positions that are worse off and poorer living conditions. I want to talk about a particular example which I've had experience with in the very recent past. So what you see on your screen with the green outline is called the Drift Sands Nature Reserve. It was one of very few provincial nature reserves that were hosted in an urban settlement, but this is in the metropolitan area of the city of Cape Town. It was established in 1983, so before democracy, and what we've seen over the last 30 years is a gradual encroachment of various settlements along the boundaries. Initially, and this was around the time of democratization, Sikumbule coming in on the southern side of the reserve, closely followed by Los Angeles informal settlement and Green Park informal settlement, following waves of informality roughly every 10 years. This changed dramatically during COVID, as we had a very rapid response from the lockdown that was happening with COVID, and we had the formation of COVID Village and Sanitizer informal settlement developing literally overnight in the hard lockdown of COVID. It prompted a lot of people who were living in these formalized areas adjacent to the nature reserve to lose their incomes and be evicted by their landlords because of that. None of this was legal. We did not allow evictions during the hard lockdown, and yet it happened, especially to our most vulnerable communities. Out of desperation for shelter, they started building their own shelter along the edges of the nature reserve, gradually encroaching on the Drift Sands Dam. This meant that within a very short space of time, literally 8 weeks, we had over 8,500 structures on a nature reserve and very few options in terms of assisting people to alternative and improved accommodation, as there simply were not funds, whilst all of our excess funds were going to the health response to COVID itself. With that kind of mass movement, you can see that it's virtually impossible for authorities to be able to respond. And when authorities were there trying to remove shacks and structures from the nature reserve, there was a very violent response from a very desperate community who just needed shelter. And this was an open piece of land. For us, climate change is a very strong reality. In the last decade or two, we have seen actively increasing temperatures and more violent and intense storms, as well as a drying on our west coast. For those people who are living in informality with very few services, this becomes something that is incredibly dangerous and detrimental to their health. Specifically in South Africa, many of our shack structures are built from corrugated iron, and studies have been done to show that during a heat wave, the temperature is roughly 10 degrees hotter inside the shack than it is outside. There are very few shade areas within our informal settlements, and combining this with poor ventilation and the fact that people are often locked up tight because they're frightened of the crime in the area, they're essentially living in what is a cool oven. Those living with poor basic services suffer intensely, but this impact is normally disproportionately high for women, children, people living with disabilities, and the elderly. And whether you're having to go and collect water or fuel for energy purposes, you have a much higher chance to be exposed to gender-based violence. And in my country, this is a reality that has hit far too many people very, very hard. We have one of the highest levels of femicide in the world. When there is a disaster, whether it's related to extreme weather from climate change or other factors, we are also seeing from some international studies that women and children are up to 14 times more likely to die than their male counterparts. So for us as built environment professionals, the question really becomes, how do you respond to that need? How do you respond to the informality that is out there, bearing in mind that it quite literally develops whilst you're busy planning something else? And it definitely doesn't take with it environmental considerations of what is best for the environment. We need to start providing dignified services that are affordable and accessible to the people who have been left behind. So for my department, we looked at 2 specific municipalities and some of their informal settlements and their upgrade programs that they were looking at. What was acceptable or appropriate municipal services? Currently, we know that most bulk services are very resource intensive and relatively inefficient. How could we be innovative about that, recognizing that there is a growing demand and a shrinking resource base, especially for those of us who live in areas where there is entrenched systemic poverty, and therefore many households are simply unable to pay the costs of services. We took these 2 sites and looked specifically at business as usual, so the infrastructure that is normally done in bulk, versus decentralized options for much less resource use and much more sustainability. Using only technologies that are already available in the marketplace and have been tested in a domestic environment, we were able to provide significant resource savings by looking at decentralized infrastructure systems. So for us, one of the big questions was, what is the operational expenditure, both from the municipality's perspective as well as from a householder perspective? Is it actually cheaper to be able to use sustainable technologies with much less resource use and actually have those savings accruing both at the municipality and at the household level? Well, the answer that we found out was absolutely, although we would have to use a new financial model. Business as usual, centralized infrastructure, we know what the costs are and the maintenance costs, but our sustainable decentralized options were much more expensive upfront, with much lower operational and replacement costs moving into the future. This was particularly important to us, recognizing that every single upgrade and development needs to contribute across the area of need for those people who it is servicing and providing dignity to. One of the really critical interventions that we identified was the ability to actually reduce the amount of violence happening within our communities through very specific targeted urban upgrade and urban choices in terms of how we design streetscapes and how we interface with surrounding developments and buildings. Can every single project actually contribute to our communities being safer and interfacing with developments as opposed to being on the other side of a very large fence? Edwards Deming tells us that every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. Our systems are no different. Our economic systems and our spatial systems have been the founding reasons why we have informality in the way that we do. Informality is not new. We know that our settlements have always changed. Over time, as families are allowed to get to grow economically and to pass down generational wealth. We know that informality can be incredibly destructive. Urbanization trends are not, however, going to change or reverse. So, like natural systems, we see settlements grow, shift, and senesce based on the resources that are available. We need to think about our addiction to order and whether or not it has actually produced a better environment for all. Informality is the manifestation of the inequality and systemic poverty which we've built into our systems. It is not a choice. It can be the start of something new. We know that when there are sudden shifts in our system, sudden changes in equilibrium, whether it's some sort of disaster, man-made or natural, there's often a response of a make-doism that has made sure that human beings have always adapted the environment that they're in to be able to cope with what they need from it. Informality, however, needs to be coaxed towards dignified services for people. And we need to genuinely question whether some of the upmarket developments that we know often gets the undivided attention of spatial planners and environmental impact assessors, whether or not it's really planet friendly, or whether we're actually just enabling a system that allows for ongoing, continued extreme resource use. We know that people who are in informal settlements use resources incredibly efficiently because they have no choice. So maybe what it is that we're looking for is a new dynamic and a new equilibrium. The 6th assessment report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change gave us some food for thought as built environment professionals. Climate change and responding to climate change needs to be part of every single element of what we do in our developments moving forward. And every development decision will move us either towards or away from climate resilience. We cannot separate the fact that informality in our cities is here to stay, but it also represents an inordinate inequity that we need to respond to, and we need to respond to it comprehensively across all development. So how should we as planners and environmentalists respond to informality? Well, maybe we can take a page out of the book of the medical practitioners and think that the first thing we should do is do no harm. Formal projects that you are involved with as a paid professional need to also contribute directly and beneficially to the environment and strengthen the natural systems that are around it, because we will need that coping capacity. All of our developments need to be as people focused as we can possibly make them. Irrespective of who the client is, we need the public to be able to interface with the development in a positive way. We need to make streets walkable. We need to make them safer for pedestrians and non-motorized transport. And we need to make sure that there are spaces for trading, whether formal or informal, and specifically and actively planned for women, children, and the elderly. These things should be standard. We shouldn't consider them to be mitigation measures. All of our planned spaces should be designed for water sustainable management, for resource efficiency, and for healthy public spaces. We need to design in such a way that we leave no one behind. And that means that every formal development must do what it can to make sure that those very causes of informality are reduced. So for me, I would say that we're actually an incredibly important link. And while informality may continue to occur, we need to find ways to embrace it as built environment professionals, and to make sure that those elements that we do control have a much healthier and more balanced interface with the public who may themselves be forced into informality. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Karen, for that really inspiring presentation. Our final speaker in this panel is Ahmed Sanda. Ahmed is an impact assessment consultant with a background in economics and environmental management and science. He's the co-chair of IAIA Tech Group, engaging with urban planners and decision makers. He lives and runs the Ashawa consultancy firm in Nigeria. To conclude today's panel, Ahmed will weave together science, philosophy, and spatial planning, not a combination you get every day. So without further ado.
Hello, my name is Ahmed Sanda, and I'll be presenting a paper themed Cities Impact Assessment, Truth, Myth, and Fiction. And this is part of the Think Big 2050 City Development Strategies Assessing the Impacts by series by International Association for Impact Assessment. As a member of the International Association for Impact Assessment, I'm an international impact assessment and systems consultant with backgrounds in economics, environmental management, as well as science, and have worked across different geographies. With that aside, I will be speaking specifically about the synthesis, the connection, the intersecting points between impact assessment and urban planning with respect to informal settlements that are going to be erupting across the world as population increases and other factors come into play. Yes, I would like you to consider these words, these options: choice versus circumstance. Specifically, again, with respect to in relation to the next two slides, where some images are going to be displayed. Starting with this one and looking at these images, I'd like us to really consider the word choices versus circumstances, and then ponder on this question specifically, which is, does where we live matter? Does where we live matter? With respect to the images that we can see, these neighborhoods with its infrastructure, serenity, lights, stability, security, and safety. Then I'd like you to move further and transpose or transfer those emotions, if you like, or ponderings to these images, pondering on the question, does where we live matter, given choices and circumstances in relation to these images. Interesting, isn't it? Anyway, choice versus circumstance, together with does where we live matter, actually the theme or the subject matter of a recent survey we carried out. And the reactions and results from 172 respondents in Lagos State, specifically in Makoko area, and informal settlements, with every aspect, with everything that you can, environmental or social issue that you can imagine. We carried out these surveys, and as you would expect, the results can be predictable, and some of the reactions were quite animated. For example, when we asked about the preference of where the respondents would choose to live, while it was comical, other people was like, it's no brainer, and some people were actually thought we were playing with their intelligence. But the results was that all 172 people just said, okay, no brainer, we're moving there. That was predictable. When we went further to ask if they had a choice, limited or unlimited, where they would choose to live, again, the results were predictable, as anybody would. However, or let's say, when we moved it a bit forward and then ask questions in relation to what are the circumstances that could make or force them to live in places of their choices or their preferences, we started getting some mixed reactions with long lectures and, preaching and things like that, but with smiles and all the usual things that would come with mixed emotions and mixed feelings, right? However, when we took it up a notch, which is actually the focal point of the survey, we wanted to find out what things, even including crime, would the respondents commit just to live in their preferred community or their preferred neighborhood or their preferred cities with all the glam and the infrastructure that is available. About 40% of the respondents were decisive, saying that they would commit any sorts of crime, any sort, and they just said, just think about it, they will. If the conditions, if circumstances were if it's out of their choices, and specifically if it's about circumstances, they would commit any crime, and then live in where they prefer. And if you went further, this is one area that we couldn't actually decipher. As much as 40% of them refused to answer that question, saying that we should remove the aspect of the criminal act out, and some were quite upfront. But that's where the issue lies, in trying to see how they react and how they respond. Nonetheless, the result of this survey was used to extrapolate the kinds of risks that planned communities, planned cities like those pictures we see earlier face as a result of the impact of rising population together with climate-induced refugees, where the human to living area spaces ratio diminishes. These are the kind of risk. Using psychosocial impact assessment, we're able to extrapolate those risks, and we're able to actually rank some of the hazards. And this part of the presentation, I would like to say that this is a summary of an hour-long lecture I'm going to present to a community of impact assessment and urban planners sometimes in the future. And in this area, we went further to recontextualize in the minds of some famous philosophers, famous planners. For example, John Claudius, the 19th century city planner, who was more or less concerned, or should I say, a bit transfixed with the ideas of growing cities and obsessed with sanitation and death, knowing fully well that in the past, graveyards were planned in a way that actually removes show death from our desire of wanting to live. Now, if Loudon was alive today with all the impact assessment tools, the planning tools, and the information and the data that we have, my conclusion would be that he would say that the city of Lagos, with its population rise and the threat of climate in the coastal city, he would describe Lagos and other cities similar to that as a graveyard for the living, simply because there will be no space, no allowances to create all those things that we like, that makes a city flourish in terms of safety, good air, nice security, and good infrastructure. By that, he would be suggesting that cities, graveyards, will have to serve multiple functions in a city like Lagos in the next 50 years if nothing was done about it, specifically because the human to living area spaces ratio would so tighten and that we wouldn't have such leverages. So it is about mitigating the effect and predicting what would happen in the future. So indeed, it is about the future and what the population and the crisis of climate could do in relation to creating climate refugee. So to a last extent, it is about the future, when population explodes and scores of refugees are forced to erupt on informal settlement adjacent to our planned cities. And there goes another question, forgive me of asking about 3 or 4 questions by now. How can we contribute to the legacy of what our immediate future will leave behind? And this is the place where I'll say, choose your captain. Mine would be Patrick Stewart, Jean-Luc Picard. As a joke, what I'm saying is, how do you contribute to that as impact assessors and as planners or spatial planners? In a situation whereby we know the data, the models has shown that these are the things that could happen if a few things are not being taken into consideration. Again, move forward, but transferring some of those thoughts and look at the image on the top right, this city here, and then I'm asking a rhetorical question this time around. What accounts for this? The infrastructure, the serenity, the safety, apparent safety, the beauty, the high livability index that you could see here, and the harmony for this. What accounts for this? If you say proper planning, fantastic planning, yes, you're right. If you say bit of impact assessment, you're right. If you say a lot of thinking, deliberate thinking, you're absolutely right. But then move your thoughts to this image down here, the bottom left, where it says on plan, and see the the beautiful smile from this young lad going to school and say, what accounts for an environment like this, which is an informal settlement in Lagos, Makoko area, as I said, and the population, depending on the literature you read, it's about anywhere between 800,000 to about a couple of millions. What accounts for this? If you can tell and be predictable and say, really, with certainty, what accounts for this? Now move those thoughts and say, and ask yourself these questions. It's rhetorical, by the way. What accounts for this? Therein lies the opportunity for a synthesis of ideas, convictions, commitment, and thinking. This synthesis is about so many things, but certainly not about participatory planning. And it's also not about stakeholder engagement, because all those have their limitation in terms of how it's applied. It's neither about defensible spaces, nor is it so much about safe cities, even though some elements of that to come into play. And this is where truth, myth, and fiction of some impact assessment tool, which I know a little bit about, comes in. The truth about impact assessment is that the tools are actually adaptable as they're evolving to adapt to different situations. That's the truth about it. And it creates an opportunity to create a multidisciplinary methodology using some special planning tool to be able to address the issue, the menace, the predictable menace that informal settlements that are going to erupt around the many cities in the world in the next 50 years, when population is different in certain areas around the developing countries, we know are going to double or triple. That's not to say that some cities in the developed nations are not going to suffer from the same. We already see them happening in terms of the migration, whether they are legal or illegal, right? To provide a context, consider this picture and moving this picture and dropping it here, so that whereby this population lives here. And then consider that the human to living area spaces ratio diminish by more than a factor of 8. And then think about the risks that we're able to extrapolate. That's why this synthesis becomes necessary. One that is multidisciplinary, that involves different tools, but certainly, I repeat, not just about participatory planning, which I would have spoken about in length, or stakeholder engagement, okay? Which presents me again the idea of why people think the myth of impact assessment. And as we are today, because impact assessment is just about 50 years old, or not more than 55, there is no myth about it yet. May we live to see 100 years more, or 1,000 years from now, people that would live to be 100, or that are going to come up, that are going to the future, our future, are going to be the one that create that myth, but not now. And as far as the fiction is concerned, there is also no fiction, because of the adaptability and evolving nature of impact assessment, which seeks to collaborate specifically to be able to predict the future in terms of what urbanization, the trends of urbanization in relation to informal settlements only. This synthesis, according to my research, should be able to produce a solution. And the solution, while it's not fixed, it's just to be able to create an environment whereby impact assessors, urban planners, impact assessment at urban planners, what architects are to planners, so that we'll be able to co-create a holistic, multidisciplinary methodology approach that will predict the risks that future informal settlements will pose when they erupt adjacent to planned cities. And the cause of that eruption is none other than the variables we talked about: population explosion, together with climate incidences where climate refugees are concerned. We're removing the economic refugees and all other variables that could play in. The models we looked at are just these two. And this is done in the context of a shrinking human to living area spaces ratio. While we ponder on these, different elements of planning and different elements of impact assessment at strategic level, or climate related, or the evolving tools of Earth impact assessment that are so much like, are taking account of so many things which should be of concern to us, specifically that the Earth carrying capacity is diminishing. So what tools can we use to be able to explore the opportunities that will create that multidisciplinary methodology that would be able to arrest or mitigate the risks identified as informal settlements erupt adjacent to our planned communities? So that's, thank you so much for listening. And I look forward to sharing the hour-long presentation with you in the future, speaking specifically about some tools and then detailing their intersecting points. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ahmed. If your goal was to open our eyes to new ways of viewing impact assessment, I think you succeeded. And thank you again to Karen and to Peter for your thoughtful and thought-provoking contributions. Thank you also to everyone who has joined us for this panel. I look forward to seeing you again in the next and final session of the IAIA Virtual Forum Series Think Big 2050 City Megagrowth, Assessing and Addressing the Impacts.